Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our ANU Indonesia Institute webinar this afternoon. Before we commence, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting, well, I'm dialing in anyways, from the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples here in the ACT. And I'd like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and pay my respects to any Indigenous First Nations peoples on the call with us today, and acknowledge the many lands around Australia and continued care and custodianship of country for more than 60,000 years. So my name is Ellie Williams and I'm a board member with the ANU Indonesia Institute and a PhD candidate here at the ANU's College of Asia and Pacific. It's a great pleasure this afternoon for me to welcome our panel this is the first one that I've convened. I'm not sure if there have been, I think there have been other webinars in the last year or so, but since we've had a bit of a board refresh, we're coming back to life again a bit after COVID. And we are still enjoying being able to capitalise on the online hybrid in-person mix of events. But it's a great pleasure this afternoon to be able to welcome you all to this webinar, which is looking at deepening the Australia-Indonesia relationship through study abroad and research collaboration, showcasing stories of success from ANU alumni. And this afternoon, you're going to hear from three fantastic alumni who are here to share their stories with you. And I'll introduce them properly in a moment, but we have Claudina Milawati with us, who's the Deputy Director for the Department of Education at the Embassy, the Australian Embassy in Jakarta. We have Gatra Priyandita, who's a recent graduate, just graduated from his PhD in Coro Bell School, in the Bell School there at CAP, and now working at ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And we have with us also Dana Throssell, who is a recent graduate as well from an honours program also in the College of Asia Pacific, and New Colombo Plan scholar, and now working with KPMG. So you will notice a couple of changes just to our panellists. Unfortunately, at the last moment, Cameron Allen has been whisked away to overseas to start a new posting with the Embassy in Bangkok. So he's over there now. And unfortunately, Kiralee McKenzie, who was talking about language teaching, has actually had to teach a class this afternoon on behalf of someone else. But I think nonetheless, we have a panel of three fantastic and outstanding alumni who are going to share their stories with you. So really looking forward to our discussion this afternoon. So why did we decide to have this discussion in the first place? I want to just explain a little bit more and set the scene for our audience this afternoon a little bit. When I started thinking about what we could discuss in some of our seminars for the ANU Indonesia Institute's webinar series going forward, I wanted to look at an area that I think is perhaps under-researched, which is really looking at this issue of Australia-Indonesia relationship building. Now, this is something that my PhD research personally focuses on and something that I've had a lot to do with, as well as our panellists have had a lot to do with throughout their careers. But looking at this issue that when we often think of the Australia-Indonesia bilateral relationship between governments, sometimes we forget that actually the people within those relationships are actually the people to people making up those relationships. We focus often at the big and the high level and the macro, and sometimes I think we forget about the micro. So I wanted to really use this webinar to zoom in on these experiences from some of these alumni who have spent time studying in Australia at the ANU and spent time studying in Indonesia through ANU programs and degrees, and to look at what their understanding that they gained from a degree at ANU about Indonesia has really contributed to their knowledge and their work since leaving and what they've gone on to do with that degree and with that study. We know over the years, obviously, the Australia-Indonesia relationship has many ups and downs, and we hear about this time and time again. But I wanted to really put the spotlight on some ANU alumni who have been really using their skills and their expertise that they gained through their degrees in focusing on what Indonesia literacy and Indonesia skills can really offer graduates from the ANU. And in particular, really deeply understanding the Australia-Indonesia relationship through study at the ANU as well. So the focus on this is really about talking about Australian students who have studied at the ANU, and that's what Dana will speak to. And then for Indonesian students who have studied at the ANU as well, which is what Claudina and Gatra will speak to. And I really wanted to just have this open conversation about the contributions that these alumni are making and the depth of experience that we have here at the ANU, and to field some questions from our audience about why this matters, why building these people-to-people links is so important in terms of sustaining the relationship moving forward. So without further ado, I will also just briefly introduce the ANU Indonesia Institute for those of you who may be joining us for the first time. The ANU Indonesia Institute was founded in 2017, and it really exists as a forum or a hub to bring together academics, researchers, students, visiting fellows who are based at the ANU or around the world and zooming in and conducting research on Indonesia. So we recognise that ANU is one of the world's leading centres of academic expertise and excellence on Indonesia research. And we want to showcase that and really connect those dots, particularly with academics in the ANU who are working across different disciplines. So this afternoon, we're going to hear from 3 of those alumni. And what I'd like to do is to invite each of them to introduce themselves and their story in a little bit more detail. We'll go one by one, and then I'm going to open it up at the end with some questions that we've discussed together and open a bit of a discussion among us on the panel. And then towards the end, I would love to hear from your questions, and I'm sure our panel would love to answer some of your questions. And we'll open it up for a broader Q&A at the end as well. So without further ado, I will invite our first speaker, Claudina, who I'll introduce properly. So Claudina Miliwati is the Deputy Director with the Department of Education, Skills and Employment. And she commenced this role in 2013 at the Australian Embassy in Jakarta. Now, in this role, Claudina assists the Council for Education and Research in managing the operations of DESI in Jakarta by providing policy advice, strategic planning and administrative oversight of the department, liaising with and reporting to the National Office in Canberra. This role involves the responsibility to develop and maintain close liaison with Australian and Indonesian key education stakeholders at the government and institutional levels. And previously, Claudina also worked in other roles with DESI as a policy officer in science and technology and an information assistant before that. She's also had experience working for the New Zealand Trade and Enterprise as the Senior Business Development Manager between 2008 and 2013, facilitating business and trade in Indonesia in education, aviation, and specialised manufacturing sectors. And in this forum, Claudina joins us as an alumni of ANU who completed a Master of Science specialising in science communication from ANU in 2005. So Claudina, over to you to introduce yourself and your story.
Thanks, Ellie, and thank you for inviting me to this important occasion. So basically today, I'm just going to share my experience of studying in ANU and how it actually shapes the current work that I'm doing for the Australian government. When I first graduated in my bachelor degree long time ago, and that was in Indonesia, in Surabaya, my hometown, I have nothing to do with Australia. I have no understanding about Australia at all. And then as my first job, I applied as an information assistant for the Department of Education. So basically that provide information for public who wants to study in Australia, a generic advice. Even though I haven't been, but I was accepted to the role, which thrilled me, of course. I learned so much through the course, through my first job. And it's actually drawn my interest to Australia. So Australia is an interesting country, but I've never been. But of course, I visited Australia and I really like it. That's triggered my interest for furthering my study. So I did try to choose a program that I like, and that is science communication. It's a quite unique program, actually, that probably is not pretty common, especially in Indonesia. It's basically a communication stream, but how you communicate science to public to make it easier for public to understand. Mind you, it has nothing to do with, political or bilateral relationship. It's just something that I like to do. So I did choose that. I ended up in ANU. I really like it. I never feel that it's a difficult subject to study in a sense that it doesn't feel a forceful studying. It's all fun. So within that time of my study there, I realized that by developing people-to-people relationship, that's how we build our connections. It's not, at that time, I didn't think that, that will further shape my career in the future, but I'm thinking more into the friendship and all of the cultural aspect of it, which at the end, after I graduated, it's actually exactly what I'm doing. Fast forward, I graduated from ANU. I joined again with the Department of Education with a different role that more suitable with my background of study, becoming the policy officer in science and technology. And then I dealing more with the Indonesian Ministry, research and technology. And it does helps me. It's opening my eyes that, Indonesia and Australia is different. But here I am, that's my role on how to make a bridge between these two lovely countries that I've been in love with. So that was quite an interesting experience. And then again, I continue my position further up in 2013. As mentioned, I'm now the Deputy Director for the Department of Education. Australia has taken so much of my lifetime. I'm working for them for almost, all of my career life, as mentioned before. So I guess that's how my study contributed in my work life currently. But probably we'll discuss that a bit later when we have a bit more specific questions. So we'll just set the context now, and probably that's an enough introduction for me.
Beautiful. Thank you, Claudina, for that. It's lovely. I'll now move to our second speaker then, to Gatra, to introduce yourself. But formally, Gatra Priyandita, as I mentioned before, is an analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, or ASPI, where he leads a project researching cyber-enabled IP theft and economic espionage. Gatra is a political scientist by training, specialising in the study of foreign policy and security in Southeast Asia. And before joining ASPI, he completed his PhD in political science at ANU in the Bell School, as I mentioned, where he looked at Indonesia's response to the rise of China. Gatra holds 8 years of research experience working extensively on projects studying Indonesian foreign policy, Southeast Asian security, and cybersecurity. He has fieldwork experience in China and also across Southeast Asia. In addition to his busy role at ASPI, Gatra also is currently a non-resident WSD Handa Fellow at the Pacific Forum, where he's continuing his study on Sino-Indonesian relations. And he's also part of its Young Leaders program. Now, Gatra is one of those rare gems that we like to think of as a double alum. So Gatra also, in addition to completing recently his PhD at the Coral Bell School, also received a Bachelor of Asia Pacific Security Studies with honours from the ANU in 2014. And outside of his native Indonesia, Gatra has lived in Austria, the United States, China, and Australia. So very well versed in international relations in life and in work. So over to you, Gatra.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Ellie, for the introduction. And thank you and the Indonesia Institute for organizing this event covering an extremely important topic at a time when Australia-Indonesian relations, well, Australia's importance to Indonesia is becoming more important and vice versa. So as Ellie has mentioned, I'm an analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. It's a role that I started in March 2022. And beforehand, I did my PhD at the ANU. But my relationship with Australia actually goes back to September 2006. So, and not just Australia, Canberra specifically. And I've lived for around 14 years of my life in this amazing city. I first came to Australia as a 12-year-old back then when my mother, who was a diplomat, an Indonesian diplomat, was posted here in Canberra. And I was in year 8. And funnily enough, I was in the same school as Curly McKenzie, who's meant to be one of the panelists coming today. And Curly and I went to middle school here together at Alfred Deakin. We went to high school here together and undergraduate studies here together. We only split ways in 2014 when she took up, once we graduated, and she took up the more noble role of teaching the next generation of Indonesia enthusiasts, and I took up the less noble role of joining the defense think tank. But my interest in Australia and Southeast Asia as well, and I guess the relationship between Australia and Southeast Asia really was fostered during my earlier years here in Canberra. So the late 2000s, I did classes in politics and security. And in year 12, I was in that position where I had to start choosing what degree to take up. And ANU was already on the radar. And I decided to take up Asia Pacific Security as a degree, because at the time there was growing intellectual debate in Canberra about Australia's place in the world. Hugh White's Power Shift quarterly essay, for example, came out at the time, which talked about Australia's place in between China and the US, right? And this made me more interested in understanding Australian defense and foreign policy, but as well as understanding Southeast Asia's place in the world, specifically Indonesia's place. And I came to the ANU knowing that it was probably one of the best places in the world to study Asia outside of Asia itself. ANU is home to some of the leading programs for Indonesian studies and Southeast Asian studies and Australia's relationship with the region. So I was taught by some of the leading scholars in the field. And in 2014, once I finished my honors, I took time off from Australia to visit China and also did some work in Indonesia. And that was when I first realized how much I would miss Australia. I remember in 2015, I was looking at Spotify, and one of the top-rated songs I've been listening to had been things by Midnight Oil, which is an Australian band. So I came back here to do a PhD in 2016, studying Indonesia's relationship with China. And again, learning from some of the best minds on the region. And in that time, also spoke to a bunch of policymakers here in Australia and also defense specialists. Ellie and I were in the same PhD department at one point before she defected to the School of Cultural History and Language. And, that specific school, our department, not that school, our department had one of the highest concentrations of Indonesian study specialists in the world. We were literally walking amongst giants. And that's why, I guess ANU specifically was very attractive as a place for me to stay in. And outside of my studies, I was also active organizationally in trying to promote both Southeast Asian and Indonesian cultural and societal literacy in Canberra. So through things like the Australia-Indonesia Youth Association, and also by forming the ASEAN Society at ANU. So I was a delegate, for example, at the Conference of Australia and Indonesian Youth, the CAUSINDI in 2017, and continued to follow other events afterwards. And this year, after finishing my PhD, I started career here at ASPE to continue on studying Australia's relationship with Asia, as well as contribute to discussions here about how Australia can improve its relationship with Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and the rest of the world.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Gatra. There's so many more things I want to ask you about, so we'll get to that in our broader conversation later. But thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to now introduce our third speaker for today, Dana Throssell, who also deserves a special mention for coming in at the 11th hour to fill in for Cam. So thank you, Dana, for making time in your busy day. But Dana joins us. Dana is a young professional working for KPMG as a consultant in policy, economics, and public interest, with a focus on gender policy and state and federal government clients. In 2020, Dana completed her Bachelor of Asian Studies, majoring in Indonesian language, and a Bachelor of International Security with honours at the ANU, and received first class for her thesis on female jihadism and how gender has impacted the counter-terrorism response. Lots to unpack there as well. During her time at the ANU, Dana spent over a year in Indonesia studying, interning, and travelling as a New Colombo Plan scholar to Indonesia. She's remained connected to the region since coming home in her previous role as project manager for the ASEAN Australia Youth Strategic Partnership, or ASIP, such a mouthful, and in her current role as Vice Chair of the Australia-Indonesia Business Council's ACT chapter. So Dana, welcome to the panel, and I'll hand over to you so you can introduce yourself a bit more.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Even though it's last minute, I always have time for forums like this, and it's great to be a part of it, to hear from everyone. I'm dialing in today from very wet Gadigal land. I'm normally based in Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, but I'm up in Sydney for the week. A great introduction from Elle. I am currently a KPMG consultant. I started as a graduate in 2021 after finishing my degree, which I found a really great kind of segue into the working world, bringing a lot of this knowledge and background with me. But I guess to focus on my experience at ANU and how pivotal that was for me. So I did a Bachelor of Asian Studies and a Bachelor of International Security Studies. And when I first was picking my degree, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew that I did want to go to ANU. I was compelled by the amount of experts and the kind of knowledge and the international focus that we do have and are privileged to have as a university. And I grew up in Perth, so that was something that we have a little bit of, but not to the same extent that ANU really offers. So in deciding what I wanted to do, I knew international security was something that really interested me, but knew I would need a language and something to pair with that. I spoke to my older sister who had been at ANU before me, and she basically said, well, if you want to do security and you want to do a language, it'll either be Mandarin, Hindi, or Indonesian. And I picked the easiest, the one that didn't have a script and tones. So that is kind of how I landed with Indonesian studies at ANU. Whilst it kind of sounds like a trite entry into the field, it's been one of the best decisions of my life. And I've been really, really lucky from there to kind of have a career in this space and to be building this knowledge and to be working with the people I have. So I would, go back and tap my older sister on the back for that conversation. But yeah, so I majored in Indonesian throughout my degree and found that a really, really useful experience. It was my first experience learning an Asian language. The Indonesian teachers at the university were incredible, and I found that a great entry. That being said, I wasn't particularly good at Indonesian until I went over and lived in Indonesia with the New Colombo Plant Scholarship. So I really have that to thank as the kind of biggest moment in terms of getting my language up to scratch and kind of starting to understand the culture on a more nuanced level and having that time to connect with Indonesian people and society. And I think there's not much that can replace that in-country learning. So that was a really central part of my degree and of my experience in this field. And then coming back to the ANU after my exchange, I was lucky enough to do a year of honours. My thesis supervisor was Greg Feely, who, for those who know, is an absolute superstar. And he was, a great mentor and guidance in the international security and Indonesian space. He is an expert on Indonesian politics and religious politics. So, and that kind of wrapped up my year. It was, I can talk about it a little bit later, but honours was a great way to really delve in a little bit deeper into a lot of this work and to connect with experts in Indonesia and Australia who work in this space. So, it was a really wonderful time, and I owe a lot to my time at ANU.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that, Dana. And isn't it wonderful when older siblings sometimes give us good advice? I think about that a lot too. I'm like, love when that happens. Doesn't happen all the time, but when it does, I'm very grateful for it. But look, thank you all so much for sharing your stories with us just to begin with. I might open us up now to a bit of a discussion just amongst ourselves. And of course, for those of you at home, please feel free to start putting in your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll keep an eye on that and come back to that towards the end in a more open Q&A. But just to kick off our discussion, I want to put this idea to the panel. We've all talked about the importance of the Australia-Indonesia relationship. We hear this everywhere. It's our, for the Australian media, it's our most important neighbour. We hear this in politics from government all the time, whether that's the coalition government for, the last decade, or whether that's the new government with the Albanese government. We hear this all the time, that Indonesia matters. It's our closest neighbour. It's the most important. It's so, we've got to get this right. The prime ministers, when they get elected, the first visit is always Indonesia. We see them heading off, and Albo is no exception in that regard. And yet at the same time, we also see conflicting data from, polls like the Lowy Institute poll, where year after year we hear these numbers, around 48% of Australians don't believe that Indonesia is a democracy. Around a third of Indonesians say that they wouldn't trust Australia, and so on. All of these kinds of figures that we see coming out in their annual polling data. I want to put this question to all of you who've spent a long time working between Australia and Indonesia. Why is it, do you think, that Australia and Indonesia don't necessarily understand each other, despite the fact that our governments think we are so important to each other? Why do we not understand each other? Maybe, Claudina, I'll start with you.
Right, sure. Thanks, Ali. It's quite interesting, isn't it? We understand that, becoming the closest neighbor, it's all important. But however, that Lowy poll shows that there is this lack of knowledge between each other. Well, there are various reasons to why Australian and Indonesian have a lack of understanding of each other. In an increasingly connected world, public perception does matter. I guess the frequent negative stereotypes and prejudice that we have could actually create that lack of understanding. For example, there's a lot of media coverage in Australia about, Indonesian that is not so positive about the context that we put back then in 1997 riot and violence. And then there was the Bali bombing in 2002 and 2005 that makes, Indonesia seems to be like a bomb places, I suppose. And then there's also the story about Corby before Bali 9 execution and all of those things. I think similarly, that also happens in Indonesian media when there's something happening in Australia and then they only publish the negative aspect of it. So it's vice versa. So there's a lot of things to do here on how we could improve the mutual understanding. Well, education is the key pillar for that. We all understand that people-to-people relationship is very important and how education is the bedrocks for that one. Dana just mentioned to us that NCP program really helps her to understand and connect much more to Indonesia. Similarly to all of us studying in Australia, help us to understand Australia better. So more human connection between both of us, it will help to improve the knowledge and understanding from each other.
Yeah, thank you. Gatra, what do you think about this issue? I know that you've done some analysis in this area as well.
Well, I completely agree with what Claudina has said. I think the fact that stereotypes probably dominate discourse, harms the relationship in many ways. And the relationship is marked by I think what President Yudhoyono used to refer to as like preposterous mental caricatures, right? Australians tend to see Indonesia as a more authoritarian, more religious, less stable place. And in a similar vein, Indonesian perceptions of Australia are often very much shrouded in anti-Western undercurrents that are sort of tied into like narrative, nationalist narratives back home. And a lot of the news stories involving Indonesia and Australia and vice versa are often very emotional. So it's things like illegal migration, drugs, terrible tourists in Bali. These kinds of news stories paint a very negative image of the other. And in many ways, the reason why I think a lot of these images shape the relationship, at least at the day-to-day level, as one might want to call it, right, is because there's a lot of unfamiliarity in Indonesia of Australia and vice versa. And unfamiliarity with the other is often a natural cause for suspicion between countries. And as a result, unfamiliarity breeds uncertainty, which creates room for distrust. I think it's really important to, as Claudina mentioned, somewhat encourage, obviously encourage more people-to-people interaction, but also at the same time, somewhat integrate more knowledge about Australia into the Indonesian education curriculum and vice versa. I went through the school system here in Canberra, and we did cover a bit of Indonesian history, mostly Cold War stuff. So perhaps that's the image that a lot of Australians may have of Indonesia. And Australian studies is not very well covered in Indonesian universities. If we're able to sort of focus on narrative construction at the school level and encourage more understanding of the history of mutual histories, I think that will create some interest in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think certainly that issue of starting earlier, we see this in both countries. Why is it that students are getting to high school, getting to university, and they don't even know anything about these neighbouring countries? It's a really important point. Thanks, Gatra. Dana, what do you think about this?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'd obviously have to agree with everything Claudine and Gatra have both said, and so eloquently said as well. I'd also just add, I think one of the greatest barriers is the mutual tourism and the kind of the shallowness of a lot of that tourism, in the sense that it is really difficult for Indonesians to get visas to come to Australia and to see our country and to experience it, which means that there's a lot of people who don't get the people-to-people links and don't have a real reason to connect to Australia and to study it. I think a lot of people see a payoff of studying foreign countries to be there and to experience that and to live there. So if you don't get that opportunity, it can be quite difficult to justify the year's worth of academic study, and vice versa for Australians going to Indonesia. Obviously, the vast majority of tourism still centres on Bali, and a lot of that tourism is not positive tourism or isn't perceived as such. So in some ways, that tourism can really harm the relationship more than it builds those people-to-people connections and strengthens that. So I think that's a really interesting kind of sector that has a lot of benefit, but a lot of untapped benefit across the country, or both countries.
And just to touch on something that you've mentioned there, Dana, this idea, I suppose, that it's visas, it's tourism, some of these issues are, our getting to know each other, if you like, is kind of hindered by people not being able to access each other's country. And certainly I've got friends at the moment who from Indonesia who've been trying to come to Australia on tourist visas, haven't been able to get a visa. It's been over 13 weeks now. They've been waiting a very long time. And yet Australians, we can still get a visa on arrival these days. It's much simpler. But another factor with that, I think also that this highlights is the socioeconomic status implicit in that, which is, does this mean that simply getting to know each other and building those people-to-people relationships, does this mean that that's only going to happen to people who can actually afford it? What's happening here if our governments are not facilitating that better, or if we're not actually allowing people who may not be able to afford tourism, as you say, in Australia, or going there in some way? How else might we be actually developing those relationships, for people particularly who can't afford it to go there? Any thoughts on that from panelists? Dana?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first. I think that's a really good point. And whilst I say obviously that travel and being in country is invaluable, it's obviously not accessible for a vast number of people coming from both countries. Something I found that's kind of really blossomed in the last few years that has been pivotal, I think, to the shaping of this relationship is the growth of networks and virtual networks, especially those centering around young people. So I was lucky enough when I came back from exchange to join the recently formed ASEAN Australian Youth Strategic Partnership, which plays a similar role to that of the Australia-Indonesia Youth Association, and these kind of networks that do operate to support people not only in country, but also who have an interest and want to come along to language immersion classes and online panels and these kind of events that can really connect people across the countries in a way that we haven't been able to before. So I think that's been something really positive kind of coming out of the last few years of a lack of travel, is that we've been forced to still connect and to strengthen those that online presence.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, and certainly, would commend the work of ASIP and AYA in doing those online activities. I mean, Claudina, what has the picture been like, I guess, from an Indonesian view, like in Jakarta? Have you been seeing online events happening over there? Have you been seeing ways that the embassy perhaps has been supporting Indonesians to understand Australia who might not otherwise be able to afford to travel here?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for the questions. I think it's quite important for Indonesians to know more about Australia. So the way that we here at the embassy try to facilitate those, probably majority of the people who cannot afford to travel to Australia is by different ways. For example, now we do have what we call Aussie Banget Corner, APC Corner in some of the university in Indonesia. So just recently, I went to Makassar 2 days ago, actually, and they launched that in Islamic University Alauddin. So basically, it's a corner. And in that corner, there's, books about Australia. There's obviously soft toys, and there's even Monopoly in Australian version. I didn't even know that it actually exists. So just like emphasizing at what Gatra says, we have to try to educate Indonesian in that way. It's possibly, if it's not possible through formal way, we do it informally. We also have like movie weeks, for example, in which we featured some of the Australian movie and we introduce them to the, to the society here. And in which then we also try to facilitate in a way that we support them through scholarships. So for those who wants to study and not able to afford, then they can apply for the scholarship. Indonesian government also provide a scholarship that enable them to choose Australia as one of the study destination. And indeed, Australia has been the most popular as a study destination overseas for Indonesian who wants to go and study overseas. So yeah, I think there are various ways to help us to try to get to know each other, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you. And Gatra?
Yeah, if I may add, actually, I think the Australian government does extremely well in engaging Indonesians through educational, I guess, programs and scholarships and all that. And the fact that Prime Minister Albanese went to Indonesia with the announcement of more scholarships shows that there is an interest in developing. There's recognition, firstly, in Australia's strengths within the education sector, but also recognition that these are one of the few things, low-hanging fruits, I guess, that can really improve the relationship along the way. I just wanted to say that I think it's also really important to also engage vocational schools, right? Because we're talking about, for example, socioeconomic divides. Most people who can afford to go to universities in Indonesia and come to Australia, members of the middle class, perhaps, or above, or maybe a lot of them are also, I guess, fairly lucky members of the lower class. But tapping into opportunities in vocational schools and creating exchanges with Australian vocational schools will tap into a much wider market, I think, in Indonesia, and also focus on other provinces, outside of Java. So focusing in that part of the world is important. And just to sort of build up on the discussion about virtual, this emergence of virtual connections. One thing I've realized is the growing emergence of Australian social media stars on TikTok and Instagram, and these are amazing ambassadors in some ways, because as long as the material is educational and informational, at least they present. They give an interesting insight into Australian culture, customs, and languages that many Indonesians would otherwise not have access to. So it's great that a lot of Australian youths are finding social media as a way to connect and become ambassadors of their nations. I'm not sure how Indonesians can reciprocate. I don't know how big TikTok is in Australia, but something that's highly worth exploring for AYA and other youth associations.
That's good to know. You might have to share that in the chat, I think, Gathra, in case people are interested in who some of these influencers and superstars are who will start following their accounts. But thank you for that. I also would add, just on your point then, Gathra, around the vocational education. We know that this has been a priority for Jokowi, for example. And I think it's also interesting when I talk about this issue of, say, scholarships and the new Colombo plan in higher education. There's a lot of representatives in the vet sector here and, from TAFEs and so on, who would say, well, this is why has this always been prioritized in higher education and not for the vet sector? There's a lot of willingness there for their students also to be able to travel to Indonesia with scholarships like the NCP or something similar to expand that, sector over there, to build up skills. And I think that this is part of the pillar with Catalyst as well. And perhaps, Claudina, you can talk more about that, I'm not sure, but looking at skills development as well in Indonesia as part of that, and of course including vocational skills as well there. So I agree that I think that could be a real booming industry if we want to actually look at expansion and opportunities there too. One of the things that we hear a lot about, and I'm very keen to get all of your opinions on this, but one of the things that we hear a lot about in Australia in recent years, of course, and that's very alarming for us who follow Indonesian studies and who work in this area, is, of course, the decline in the number of students studying Indonesian language and the number of students who are then equipped to become teachers of Indonesian language as well, and this kind of cycle that we see. I'm interested, particularly, Dana, you've studied Indonesian, at university level, you've gone over and studied it in country. Obviously, Claudina and Gathra, you work with people every day who've studied Indonesian, and you've been around people who've studied Indonesian as well. I'm interested from all of you, different perspectives, as to why this keeps happening. Why are we seeing such a decline in Indonesian language learning and teaching in Australia at a time, again, there's this paradox, at a time when we're being told that this is so pivotal, this is such an important relationship. What's going on here? What's that kind of disconnect? Maybe Dana, if you wanted to start off.
Definitely happy to. Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and something that everyone in this field is definitely discussing almost on a daily basis. As you said, language is so important, and it's not only to kind of allow us to communicate with people who don't speak English. Obviously, we need to learn Indonesian for that, but also understanding a different language really teaches you a lot about what that culture prioritizes and communicates and all of that. So I think it is extremely important that we do invest in language learning. I think it's interesting to see the trends of reducing enrollment, because, as you said, it's coming at a time when a lot of the discourse is saying that the relationship is more important than ever. We have a positive relationship currently, and historically the Indonesian-Australian relationship has been tumultuous. So there's been periods in which the relationship has been rockier than it is currently. And yet we're seeing not a whole lot of investment in language across the levels. And I think, I mean, I'll leave it to Gatra and Claudina to talk about the real policy elements, but I think that there's kind of twofold problem, that it comes from a lack of interest, but also a lack of opportunity for people to engage. I know when I was at school, I didn't have the option of studying Indonesian. So even if I had come to an interest earlier, it just wasn't possible for me until I came to the ANU. So I think it might be about addressing both the interest and getting people to really, from the Australian perspective, to find Indonesian and to feel that love for the country and to really want to invest in that, but then also having those opportunities to do that. But I'll leave it to Claudina and Gatra to actually talk about policy.
Sure. Claudina, did you want to jump in?
Sure. Definitely the declining interest shows that there is, it's driven by market demand. If there's not much people requested for it, then there's no market for it. What we should try to do is to cultivate the interest since a young age. You're probably aware of ELA, the language, learning of other language, in which Bahasa Indonesia is actually in one of those 13 languages that is trialing in that particular program. And that's for the, I think, preschool kids. And then here we also try to have, you will be familiar with the Bridge. Bridge is trying to connect the Indonesian and Australian school, in which then they also be able to communicate mostly by electronic ways, for sure, because not everyone can travel to Australia, noting that differences in economic earlier. So they try to connect each other and have this communication and share the cultural and language learning a little bit as well. I know that some of the Australian school is trying to sing happy birthday in Bahasa Indonesia as well. And then they try to put some Indonesian traditional food and vice versa. So I agree that it has to be invested in such an early stage. So like learning the language and then through the school connection. And then when you reach the age that you can actually choose, like Ghana, for example, there are more opportunities. Like in the university, you can then join the NCP that will enable you to go to Indonesia and other countries to study a little bit more about what's happening around Australia in Asia Pacific. And then apart from the government, we should also acknowledge that there are many of the individuals that have passion, just like Greg, for example, who's very passionate, and those kind of passion actually very helpful in developing further people to get interested as well. And of course, your previous institution, Archigis, have done such a great job as well. So I guess Archigis is, was established to make it easier and to overcome the boundaries that, is established by the government and whatever, and try to facilitate that connection and relationship for Australian who wants to study in Indonesia as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Claudina. That's some great points. I'll come back to the in-country aspect of it in a bit. But Gatra, for you?
Sure. I think I remember someone's, I think the relationship between Australia and Indonesia has long been a victim of high expectations. Probably almost every single Australian Prime Minister since at least Paul Keating have talked about Indonesia being such an important country to Australia. In a similar vein, like a lot of Indonesian leaders openly talk about Australia as being an important country. Jokowi called Australia as one of Indonesia's best friends when he came over to here, right? And all leaders have talked about the importance of mutual importance, of the importance of the other, of having like a good relationship with the other as a high priority in foreign relations. And I Claudina has mentioned that, part of the reason why Indonesian language learning might be in decline is because of low demands, which I suspect is quite true, because I think Indonesian has to compete very hard now with Japanese and Chinese increasingly, right? Which seem to offer more opportunities to language learners than Indonesian would. But I think this should not, language learning should not be guided by market principles. It should be deeply integrated into a national strategy. And, the government, both the Australian and Indonesian governments, need to exercise leadership to improve people-to-people ties. And a decline in language learning should not be seen as, let's just get more Korean language or more Hindi or whatever instead. Australia recognizes that Indonesia is important, and Indonesia recognizes that Australia is important. And in both of their national strategies, foreign policy strategies, there is recognition that good ties with Indonesia matters. Similarly, Indonesia recognizes good ties with Australia matters. I think there should be more encouragement from lower ages, and both governments have a vested interest in pushing both, I guess, Indonesian language learning in Australia and I guess more Australian literacy in Indonesia, because in the long term, this relationship would become more interdependent anyway.
Yeah. Look, I think that's a great point, Gatra, and you're kind of leading into something I wanted to touch on next as well, which, I mean, that point there around, economic significance or market access and opportunities and so on. I mean, this is nothing new. Asia literacy in Australia has always been framed in terms of, economic strength and importance. You think back to the Asian tigers in the 80s and 90s, you think back to the framing of, learning Chinese and, Mandarin under the Rudd years. This is not new. Even the NCP was never really positioned as a language learning exercise. It was about getting to know the region and bringing those skills and expertise back to Australia for benefit to Australia, very clearly. So thinking about this as a kind of exercise, I suppose, in gaining Asia literacy as a tool for economic gain for Australia's benefit was always the positioning. But this sort of opens up another aspect, and you've touched on it just then, that this needs to be the responsibility of both Australia and Indonesia. But I guess for, Dana and Claudina, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this as well. I mean, is this Australia's responsibility to be increasing Indonesian literacy? Or is this the Indonesian government's? We see, and there's actually a question that's just come in the Q&A, kind of relates to this. We see other governments and other countries around the region, China through the Confucius Institutes, obviously Korea with K-pop and the sensation of, BTS, and Japan through anime and manga, and India through Bollywood and similar initiatives. Like, people argue that Indonesia has a bit of an image problem, or maybe Indonesia needs to work harder on kind of selling itself and the Indonesian language learning as part of its soft power approach. I mean, what do you guys think about this in terms of whose responsibility this is? Is this a soft power exercise that Indonesia needs to be doing more on, Claudina, or is this actually a policy setting failure that Australia needs to be doing more on, Dana? And then maybe Gatra, if you come in at the end, or Claudina.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? I've been thinking about this, and it's quite challenging, to be honest. I'm sure Indonesia has the interest in these matters, because ultimately we need to promote Bahasa Indonesia to the world, and especially to Australia, which is the closest neighborhood. They do have the program that they set up, Dharma Siswa, that's try to entice people from all over the world, including Australia, to learn Bahasa and come to Indonesia for about a year, if I'm not mistaken. However, I also think that Australia has a significant role in this as well. That, in my understanding, there is in Australia curriculum that there is a foreign language aspect of it. But I'm not sure whether you have to, there's several options in it. And then again, it's driven by the demand. If the school children never been exposed to Indonesia, how can they be interested in Indonesia? I guess it's also another thing that we touch base in here is language and culture is something that inseparable. Like, for example, why Korea is so popular? Because they have K-pop. They have everything in cultural setting that, draw interest of these youngsters. Everybody wants to study Korea. Even like a simple things like, I've recently noticed that Subway in Indonesia becoming very popular, and people are queuing for long hours. And that's just because that Subway is actually eaten in Korean movies. Can you believe that? I'm just gobsmacked with that fact. So I don't know whether we, Indonesia, should invent something like that, that then could create, something that everybody wants to be like that. I don't know. Maybe others can help me on that.
I think it's great. I actually think Gojek needs to expand to other parts of the world, and then they'd realize how popular that is, and Indonesia would instantly be a hit. But that's my personal take.
Go Massage needs to expand to Australia.
Yes, please.
And Go Clean, please. I need all of the services.
Totally. Dana, what do you think about this issue?
Yeah, again, a good question. And I definitely agree with Claudina. I think part of it is the kind of cultural draw. People, I mean, they don't, with things like with Korea, people aren't studying Korean and then watching K-pop. It's people watching K-pop and then studying Korean. So it'd be interesting to see if trends like that do get people involved. But on the flip side, as Gatra said before, I think viewing this as only something that needs to be a response to market demand means that we're not actually investing in the longer term importance of the relationship. And I think from the Australian perspective, something that has damaged the relationship previously is, I guess, this lack of perception that Australia doesn't respect Indonesia as much as it should. And I think that comes down to a person-to-person level as well, and that not enough Australians are taking the time to invest in the language and taking the time to understand the culture. So I think it is the Australian responsibility as well, and the Australian government's responsibility to set up that relationship that is founded on mutual respect. Because if we expect people to come to Australia and be able to speak English to experience the culture and tourism and come to our institutions, then we need to be expecting the same for Australians going overseas. And that needs to be a stronger pathway that we're really developing from a young age, as we've said throughout this conversation. So yeah, I think a lot of the burden does also sit on Australia. If we are going to keep positioning ourselves as a leader in this region and as a best friend of Indonesia, then we need to kind of act like that.
Yeah, it almost speaks to a degree of kind of cultural arrogance, really, on our part in Australia, that there's been that expectation for so long, or that assumption rather, that we can just go anywhere, everyone speaks English, it'll be okay. But it's so arrogant, to assume that you go there and people would just automatically speak English. I mean, yes. Gatra, what are your thoughts on that?
I think there's probably very little I can add to what Claudina and Dana have said. I think they've covered a lot of it. I think both governments have responsibility to encourage more Indonesian language learning. In Indonesia's case, as Claudina has mentioned, there are already programs in place. So things like the Dharma Siswa program, and Indonesian embassies are given a budget to teach Indonesian language, for example. But there are Cypriot aspirations for for becoming one day a regional or great power in Indonesia, and we don't live in a system where right simply means might, right? Well, might means right. So, you have to buttress that with strong cultural power as well. And how can you win over other states if you don't win over the people? So I think the Indonesian government should have a clearer soft power strategy to support Indonesian media companies, Indonesian cultural institutions, to promote Indonesian movies, Indonesian culture, and encourage Indonesian businesses to go overseas as well. I mean, some Indonesian unicorns are already setting up shop in Australia, which is great news. Investing in Melbourne, for example. At the same time, Australia obviously needs a longer-term strategy on national language learning, because if Australians can't speak Asian languages, then it's going to find it very difficult to engage with the rest of the region and get rid of that image of being basically a Caucasian outpost in the Indo-Pacific, right? Now, outside of government, I think many other actors have a role to play, and that includes many of us here, diaspora, academia. Greg Feely is someone who's very strongly passionate about Indonesia. I think exposing a lot more stories about the relationship in the media is important, and members of the Indonesian diaspora need to also step up and present an image of Indonesia in Australia that I guess would be distinct from the usual stories about Bali and boats and so on. And in the same vein, I think those Australian ambassadors on TikTok are amazing, are already amazing at promoting Australia in Indonesia. More of that would be good. And this would hopefully foster some interest in the country, because we want to sell a story that Australians should have an interest in Indonesia and vice versa, right? We want to empower this relationship. So presenting that the relationship is full of opportunities is pretty important.
Absolutely. And I think you've highlighted a really important actor actually who often gets, neglected when we're talking about this, and that is the role of the diaspora, for Indonesians living abroad who can play such a role in actually promoting Indonesian culture and do anyway, but we don't hear enough about them. We don't hear about the work that they do. Think about Indonesians in Australia who are teaching dance, who are working as teachers' aides in our classroom, who are helping out with tutoring, who are helping out with homework, and who actually portray this vision and this image of Indonesia as it is today, as opposed to perhaps antiquated and outdated stereotypes of what Indonesian language and cultural learning is. And I think Indonesian diaspora, not just in Australia, but around the world, play a really important role. So I think that's a great point to highlight as well, Gatra. Now, I'm conscious we've got some questions coming in our Q&A, which is great. So to our audience, please keep those coming. I'm going to ask one more question of our panel, and then I'm going to open it up to our broader Q&A. But for all of us here, I want to put this question to you. Sometimes I think in Indonesia, we hear, maybe it's a bit of a stereotype. I'm not quite sure. I'd be interested in Gatra and Claudina's thoughts on this in particular. But there seems to be a bit of a trend in Indonesia where people often think that Indonesia and Australia relations go better when there's an Australian Labor government in Parliament. And I wonder whether this is actually true. Does this hold up? Is there any weight behind this, or is this just a bit of a myth in kind of public opinion? But what are your thoughts on, I suppose, a new government? We have a new Labor government. Are we going to see some improvements in the Australia-Indonesia relationship, at least by public opinion? What are your thoughts on what ordinary, everyday Indonesians think about this new government? And for Dana, what do you think? I mean, we have Penny Wong recently and Anthony Albanese touring around Indonesia to this point around language learning. Penny Wong is there delivering speeches in Indonesian. What does that look like and feel like to an Australian voting public? How does this new government, how are they being received from both an Australian and an Indonesian perspective? And I might start with you, Claudina.
Sure, thanks. It's quite interesting, isn't it, that the new government been elected, and obviously we have known that Australia-Indonesia has been trying to improve the relationship over the year. It started with the comprehensive partnership, and then it's elevated again into the comprehensive strategic partnership, and it's elevated again with the ICEPA, and then now with the recent government that has been sworn for couple months, I suppose, and then visited Indonesia as the first country. And I guess that shows that the new government understands the importance of Indonesia. It's been quite customary now for all PM being elected and then visited Indonesia as the first time. And that's a positive image that we have here, because once that he jumped into the plane, bringing a senior delegation to Indonesia, the Indonesian media covers it really well, and I'm sure Australian media also. And that actually what we need in this kind of relationship, because it shows that if it's important, then it means you're visiting your friends. And then Jokowi as well received that and got a very wide, good coverage in this part of the world. And having Penny Wong as well as part of the trip is actually pretty good, because it's represent, the Asian, Southeast Asian countries that is been elected as part of the cabinet, which is fantastic. That shows that we as an Asia countries having somebody to be represented in Australian government. And I think another good move that PM made is not just visiting Jakarta as a big city, but he also visited Makassar, which is outside of Java. And everybody knows, and people in the region would feel this, that, you often feel neglected. When I had a meeting with the rector in Universitas Hasanuddin in Makassar a few days ago, he told me that he has not yet recovered from the pleasant surprise, and he will not pay until the next year, he says.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's really positive. I think that is a good image that we have at this moment for the new government in Indonesia.
Yeah. Likewise, Claudina, I think Liam Prince and colleagues at Achichis have also not yet recovered from the pleasant surprise of being mentioned in Albanese's speeches, both in Bogor and in Makassar, of increased funding to Achichis. But yeah, it's that point as well, isn't it, around, it's not just at Jakarta, but it is Makassar was such an important decision to include that in the itinerary. I completely agree. Gatra, what are your thoughts on this with the new government?
So I think Albanese has definitely inherited a relatively robust relationship with Indonesia. There hasn't been any major turbulence in the relationship since the Abbott years. And you're right, the perception back home is that the Labour Prime Minister or Labour government is probably more empathetic to Indonesia's interests because of their more focus on multilateralism, for example, over the US alliance. I mean, these are stereotypes and these are simple images, but perceptions matter for a reason because people come in and make policy based on these perceptions and images, right? So because of these factors, he's come in fairly strong. I did really appreciate his visit to Indonesia. I think that was a good move to choose Indonesia as the first state visit. And going to Makassar really separated him from a lot of the past prime ministers who made it seem like visiting Indonesia was just something on a checklist, right?
Yeah,
That's right. And his introduction of the scholarship programs and so on, talking about development into Eastern Indonesia. These are things that the Indonesian government is likely to appreciate as well, because these are key priorities for the government. So thus far, I've been very happy. And Penny Wong also visited, KL and Singapore, in the past month or so. And she said the things that I think Indonesian officials really would appreciate. Concepts like strategic equilibrium, in contrast to balance of power. These might seem like they might seem like very similar things. In many cases, they are. but to diplomats in the region, these are words that matter, right? Because these send signals about what Australia's interests and visions are for the region. Penny Wong speaking in Indonesian as well was also a very important move, but a very calculated move that obviously became quite viral, I think, in Indonesia and was very much appreciated by a lot of Indonesians. So I'm quite optimistic in that sense. And the fact that the government is also more focused on non-traditional security issues like climate change really creates more opportunities for engagement, I think, with Indonesian, say, NGOs. In the same vein, it's also going to, annoy a lot of people in Indonesia, like the coal industry. But you can't satisfy everyone. At the very least, though, that creates hope for more people-to-people engagement.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gatra. I think hope and optimism, there's certainly a lot of that abounding at the moment. Dana, what about an Australian perspective on the new government?
Yeah, I think it's probably quite similar sentiments from our end as well. And I wonder how much of it will also be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that we're talking about, wanting to build interest and wanting to build people actually investing in language learning and these careers in Australia. And I wonder how much of this renewed interest from the government will inspire more people at the university level, at high school level, to actually take up language learning and to see a viable career path or a viable future working in this space because of that attention. I know already since the election, people at work have started talking about Indonesia more. People have asked me more questions. I've already written an article just internally, but about the relationship. And I think a lot of that is spurred by, even that first move of taking the tour to Indonesia. So I do wonder how much of that will kind of give itself its momentum and perhaps drive a bit more interest and a few more people hopefully participating in Indonesian studies.
Hear. That'd be a nice thing to see.
Touch wood.
Fantastic. So look, thank you to all of you. I'm now going to open this up to questions from our broader audience. And I can see there's already a few that have come in the Q&A box. But to our audience, please feel free to keep posting your questions in our Q&A box just there. I'm going to kick off just for one of the shorter questions that's in there from an anonymous attendee who asks, is there any chance for Indonesian women to continue their study and get scholarships in Australia? I'm going to just jump in there and say yes, of course, through the Australia Awards at a postgrad level. I'm also going to add at the undergraduate level, there is the new Indonesian International Student Mobility Awards as well. But I'm going to pass this one to Claudina, if you don't mind, Claudina, because I'm sure that you have some insights on this as well.
Sure. Yes, there's definitely opportunity for Indonesian women, and I like to advocate women. Women is always been important because I'm also a woman, and we believe on equal opportunity. As Ali mentioned, you could apply for the Australia Award scholarships. That's for a postgraduate level. In undergraduate level, in addition to what Ali has mentioned, there are a number of scholarship available based on institution. So it depends on the institution that you apply. They will have a various scholarships in a different value as well. I would also like to add Destination Australia Scholarship, which is less known scholarships that will provide you with 15,000 for a year of study in Australia in a selected institution. The list is available in the website Destination Australia. And then this one can be used not only to study PhD masters, but also available for undergraduate, even diploma and certificate. I think that's enough for me.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if Dana or Guthrie wanted to add anything there around scholarships. No? Okay. The second one I'd like to bring up is from another anonymous attendee who says, I am a dual Australian-Indonesian citizen who spent more than 10 years in Jakarta. I'm currently an undergraduate student at the ANU, and they're wondering whether this dual background and foreign experience would be an advantage or an impediment should they wish to enter the public service and obtain a security clearance. I'm not quite sure whether this is if you're talking about entering the Australian public service or the Indonesian public service. That's not quite made clear. So maybe to the person who asked that question, if you could actually clarify that. Again, Claudina, Guthrie, Dana, I'm not sure who would be best placed to answer this question, whether you had any insights on dual citizenship applying for security clearances. Any thoughts from the panel?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I don't even think that Indonesians are allowed to have a dual citizenship, in my understanding. So I think you got to choose between Indonesia or Australia when you already reach the age. And I think once you choose to be Australian, for example, if you're an Australian citizen, then you definitely could apply for a civil servant there. And vice versa, if you are an Indonesian, then you are eligible to apply as an Indonesian civil servant, which is PNS in Indonesia.
Yeah, that's correct. That's my understanding as well, is that you're not allowed to actually hold dual citizenship. So that would be a barrier already. Dana or Guthrie, did you have any further thoughts on this question?
I wouldn't know the answer to that specifically, but I mean, if you are at the ANU, the university does organize quite a few career fairs. And often members of the APS are also invited to attend. So, I mean, this is something definitely worth asking. Yeah, but beyond that, sorry, I'm not sure.
Okay, that's fine. There's a couple of questions in here that relate to career advice. So I'm going to turn to the first one of these, which is from an anonymous attendee as well, who asks, what are some things that you can suggest that I could do at an undergraduate level to fast track an Indonesia-related career upon finishing my tertiary studies? Are there any specific internships, programs, or societies, organizations I could join or apply to? Maybe I'll throw this one to Dana first. What are your tips here?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, because I know for a lot of friends of mine, there's this kind of idea that you can't start your career until you finish university, but that is not correct. And there's so much you can do to fast track your career whilst you're at university and really build that expertise in those networks. In terms of what I would suggest, I cannot overstate the importance of youth organizations. I know for someone who might not have been involved in them, they do sound, juvenile, but that is absolutely not the case. They are so important to the relationship. It really helps you to build expertise and connections. And I was actually just remarking the other day with a friend that being a part of those organizations has been one of the biggest skill building exercises for myself, because you do you end up taking on a whole lot of roles, lots of different things that you might not have had experience in before, and employers are valuing that more than ever. So I would really recommend the Australian and Indonesia Youth Association, ASEAN Association, ASIP, any of those kind of national or international level ones, and then whatever societies or clubs that your institution also has at a local level, because I'm sure there is one, and if not, you could always start it up. Beyond that, for internships, I know that there are quite a few, but it really depends on locality and where you are based, but definitely look at things overseas. Obviously, New Colombo plans come up a bit, whether there's short courses you can do or a teacher's program so you can get funding for, or whether you go to the Australian Embassy in Indonesia and do, before COVID, there used to be a program where you could do an internship. So whether or not that comes back, always kind of keep a lookout for those opportunities, because that will really hold you in good stead for your career.
Great tips there. Thank you, Dana. Guthrie, did you want to add anything to this?
I think Dana has covered everything. And yeah, I just can't emphasize how much youth organizations are pretty important, I think. Well, not important, but they're useful, very useful ways for you to not only network, but also, I guess, meet the, start building that career pathway if you want to get into Indonesian studies. AYA is a great association. I also recommend getting in touch with the Indonesian Students Association of your local university or institution. They're all very nice people. Always very enthusiastic about promoting Indonesian culture and language and society and so on, and great food. I'm a terrible cook, and that's how I got my food when I was a student. Yeah.
Absolutely. The food is really important. Claudina, did you have anything you'd like to add to that question?
No, I think that both of them has covered well. I probably just want to emphasize again the importance that Dana and Gatra has just mentioned. It's important to get yourself into an experience. Yes, internship is great. Try to get to NCP if possible, or internship. Dana, you remind me of a very good story here. I met with some Australian-based staff here a couple of weeks ago who told me that she was actually in that internship program that we held a couple of years ago. So no one knows. Your network is the most important thing, because by building the network, you will always get the opportunity. You never know.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's really interesting. I reflect on this as well, Claudina, just on that point. Often people feel really intimidated by the idea of networking. And I talk about this a lot with, former students, or when people are asking about mentoring, career advice, like people are just people, and it can be terrifying, this idea of networking and handing up business cards at events and so on. But actually, I think, finding someone at a conference or at an event that you go to, and actually just approaching them or sending the kind of scary email, having the courage to do that, and then really just building your network organically from there is really important as well. And, less scary than perhaps we first might think it is. People are just people. And in most cases, certainly I would say in the Australia-Indonesia space, people can be pretty friendly and approachable and happy to help out the next generation. Certainly that's something I've seen in our space.
Just to further add on that, cold emailing people is actually an amazing way and a very useful way. You can set out, and yes, it's possible that some people might not respond, but when you do get a response and they do agree to meet up for coffee, they can lend you some amazing opportunities. And that's how I got into the ThinkTech space.
There you go.
Through cold emails.
Exactly. Absolutely agree with that, and equally, I would often say to people as a good tip, for starting out, sending people an email, if you want to volunteer with that organization, if you really respect someone's work and you want to get to know them more, and offering to take them out for a coffee or to pick their brain, but also letting them know what skills you have that you can offer them, so saying, oh, I've got great social media skills, or I noticed that you guys are running an event next week. Could I come along and help out at that? Telling them what skills you have that might be valuable to them that they haven't even thought of yet. When I would get into emails like that when I was still at Chi-Chi's, and we would have volunteer opportunities, it would be amazing to have someone essentially doing the work of recruitment for you. So definitely send the cold email. I'm a big fan of that as well. A similar question, but from the other side. So this is from an Indonesian who asks, I'm interested in hearing more stories and some advice from you all on the panel about building a career in the field of Indonesia, Asia Pacific with Australia. I was wondering if the journey to land such amazing jobs that you all have now is easy. I'm Indonesian and have studied IR and Japanese studies for my bachelor at Monash, and now I'm pursuing my master's of IR at the ANU. I'm trying to find some opportunities related to the field, but it hasn't been easy since the pandemic hit. So looking for some advice and tips there. Any thoughts from the panel? Gatra, you were doing a lot of networking through the pandemic.
Yes.
Might go to you first.
I was just going to say, I mean, I guess, somewhat in that position as well some years ago. And quite honestly, it's just really getting in touch with people, coming to ASPE events, for example, coming to LOE events, coming to events at the National Security College, and just meeting people and exchanging numbers, and those exchanges become coffee catch-ups, and you'll have deep discussions, and that's the opportunity for you to prove, firstly, the skills that you have, and also to sort of and try to understand what it is that's expected in that space. So, I mean, I did IR. I mean, that was my thing as well. I focused on networking, and I also did a couple of op-eds. So it's quite important to try to get your name out there. And to those of you watching, interested in that space, you can always get in touch with me. I'm always happy to have a talk. So yeah, please do get in touch. And yeah, just network, make your write op-eds. Also speak to your professors as well, because oftentimes they'll know people who are looking for jobs, who are looking for employees and all that, and they'll probably be happy to help out.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was going to say also, don't underestimate how helpful your tutors and your lecturers can be as well. Dana.
Yeah, so just wanted to add to that. I think Gatra's completely right. I think networks are so pivotal, and that is probably the foundation for a lot of this. I would also say to think a little bit laterally about where you start. It's not a huge sector currently, and people hold up a couple institutions or a couple places as the only places that you can work to have a career in this space. And whilst obviously, if that's what you're aiming for, then put your heart in it. But I'd also, this is going to sound like a spruik, but I've really loved consulting, and it's not directly in this work, but we do a lot of work in the international space. We work with DFAT. There's opportunities for travel. There's opportunities to build those skills that could get you the next role. So I think this is a broader career advice, but it's really tempting to be pressured when you're coming right out of university to find your dream job on the first job. But that's not always possible. So you can also think about where you might build the skills to then get your dream job following on from that. So don't hold yourself to too high standards if it is a really tough job market. But yeah.
Thank you. And how about for you, Claudina? How have you carved out your career, and any advice you'd give to this particular questioner?
Oh, well, thanks. To be honest, firstly, I landed to this job. My first job was based on luck, because I don't have the background necessary for my work. And like typical Indonesian, you usually get a job where it gives you the job, not necessarily the one that you're good at, because my background was industrial engineering. So this has nothing to do with education relationship. But then over the year, that's what my interests are, and that's why I'm still here. But again, what has been said is true. Network, because even nowadays, like people still ask me, like if they've got a job opening, and then they'll ask me, could you recommend someone? So that obviously shows that it is important for you to know that someone, and that someone could be anyone. It could be your supervisor, it could be your friends, it could be someone that you meet at a coffee shop or in a related talk. In a talks like this, for example, Gatra has kindly, willing to be a point of contact if you are looking for one. So yeah, that will be something for you to do. Just expand your network, and hopefully that you can land in the job that you're dreaming of.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Claudina. There's been a few requests as well from audience members asking if panelists would feel comfortable sharing their contact details. Feel free to pop those in the chat if you feel comfortable with that to Claudina, Gatra and Dana. I'll also share mine in there in a moment. I'm going to turn to a couple of questions that are related from Oliver Bowden. who's asking on this issue around language education, just to go back to that, we've got 5 minutes left, so just this could probably be our closing questions. So Oliver asks, how important is Indonesian language education to promoting these people-to-people relationships? And how might declining enrollments in Indonesian courses have affected potential relationship building? So we talked a little bit about that today, but I might ask you just to sort of address that. And then he says, relatedly, secondly, is there any indication of a turnaround in Indonesian language course enrollments going forwards? Are we seeing any kind of positive threads here? Considering both NCP and other funding, as well as the election of a new government, which has an Indonesian-speaking foreign minister, of course, Penny Wong. So I guess just sort of getting a sense from the panel about that mood in terms of language education, the relationship there between language learning and relationship building, and perhaps, moving forward, do we see any sense of that turning around? Maybe Gatra, do you want to start us off on this one, if you feel you can respond to this?
Yeah, it's. I think maybe I'm not entirely sure what the current government's position on language learning is. I do suspect that with Asia's growing economic footprint in Australia and more images of opportunities in the region popping up, there probably would be more interest in language learning, both organically and perhaps even this will prompt the government to take it more seriously. The Labour Party does have a friendlier, I think, a friendly perspective on academia generally and the humanities. So I do hope that this means that you'll probably have more funding for not only big languages, but also smaller languages like, Sanskrit, for example, or Hindi, which I guess is not small in the context that, not many people speak Hindi, more like there aren't that many classes on Hindi in Australia.
Claudina, what do you think about this in terms of policy setting from an Australian government and the new government? Are we seeing any more hope or turning things around here?
I think how Australia is different with Indonesia is how different our government, because we do have federal governments and we also do have the state governments. So I think there's certain things that could be controlled by the federals. But at the end of the day, often it's also up to the state on how to bring this forward. Like in my understanding, learning the language will be up to the school, right? And the school is the state decisions. So to be honest, I think it's a bit tricky for us because unlike Indonesia, who could centralize everything and say, English is important, everybody needs to study English. Australia is a bit unique in that sense. Yeah, I don't think it's my answer actually helpful.
That's okay. Dana, what do you think about this issue?
I would obviously echo sentiments, but I think it is potentially a little bit early to tell about the kind of turnaround. Obviously, the election was very, very recently, so whether there's actually that upward trend, we can't really see yet. But I do hope that, with the increased investment, it does seem like there will be an investment in things like Achichis and those institutions that are really supporting it. So I do hope that there's that upward trend, but I can't really comment on whether we've been seeing it just yet.
Yeah, look, I think I would agree that it is probably too early to tell. It's still very early days, but certainly what I found really interesting, actually, Oliver, just in response to your question, one thing I found very interesting in the lead up to the election in the campaign period, unlike the last election when we saw in 2019, Labor went to that election with a very strong platform around Asia literacy and language learning. They were pledging to recommit funding to the Asia Education Foundation, for example. They had Chris Bowen out there, they had Andrew Lee, they had them talking about language learning and Asian literacy and so on. We didn't see that at this election. And it was interesting that, I wondered whether they kind of took that as a lesson, thinking, well, this didn't get us elected. This wasn't a very popular platform to go to the election with. And so we'll just drop that. But then actually we've seen the commitment in, as you said, in things like the Albanese speeches and in the recommitment to funding and so on. So I actually think it's an interesting, perhaps it was a campaign strategy that they didn't want to campaign on it. They didn't want to take that as a policy platform. And yet it was there as a policy platform. And we are going to see some changes in it. We're already seeing that in these sorts of speeches. but it just wasn't perhaps a campaign tactic. So likewise, I'm sort of waiting to see what happens. But in response to the first part of your question, Oliver, I think it's absolutely essential to promoting people-to-people relationships, not just between Australia and Indonesia, but between Australia and many other regional neighbours. And I personally would really like to see, Australia return to, some of the language policy setting from the 70s and 80s, where we saw a real strength in Asia languages. I'd really like to see us get back to that place. So yeah, we can see what actually changes in the relationships if we have language sort of front and center in a policy setting environment again. All right. Well, I am conscious of time as well. So we have, as I mentioned, we've had some questions here from people. Hopefully we can get to everyone now. I've seen Guthra's posted to everyone. Claudina's posted to everyone. Dana, I think you can post to everyone now as well. So I will also share, where have I got here, to everyone there as well. I'll share my email in a moment with everybody before we sign off. But I would just like to thank everybody for coming along this afternoon to this webinar, and especially to thank our wonderful panel of ANU alumni, Claudina Milawati, to Guthra Priyandita, and to Dana Throssell. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon and to share your thoughts on how you have been deepening the Australia-Indonesia relationship through your study, your research, and the career and the work that you've been doing. We're so grateful to have had you speak at this session this afternoon. And for everybody online, if you are interested in coming along to more events or to learning more about what the ANU Indonesia Institute does, please have a look at our website for more details and to sign up to our mailing list. We have lots of other events coming up the rest of this year. So on behalf of the ANU Indonesia Institute, thank you all once again for coming along this afternoon. And please do stay in touch. Check out our social media, check out our website, and join the mailing list if you haven't already. But thank you everybody so much for coming along. And I'll pop my email in the chat as well. If you have any questions, do feel free to get in touch. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for coming along.